The story begins not on the plains of Troy, nor in the palaces of Greece, but on the heights of Olympus itself, where gods and goddesses watched over mortal affairs with a mixture of amusement, jealousy, and malice. The seeds of the war were not sown in the strategies of kings or the ambitions of warriors, but in a quarrel at a divine banquet. It was at the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea goddess fated to bear a son greater than his father. Their union was celebrated with all the majesty the heavens could muster, for it was rare that gods honored mortals so openly. Every god and goddess attended save for one, Eris, the goddess of strife, who was excluded because her presence promised discord. Yet Eris would not be denied, and in her bitterness she tossed into the feast a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." In an instant, what had begun as celebration transformed into rivalry. Hera, queen of the gods, laid claim to the apple, her pride demanding recognition of her majesty. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, stepped forward, asserting that none could rival her strength and intellect. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, insisted that the apple was hers by right, for no goddess could match her radiance. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, wisely refused to decide among them, for he knew no choice could be made without incurring the eternal wrath of the others. Instead, he appointed a mortal judge, one who was distant from Olympus, yet famed for his fairness, Paris, the young prince of Troy, a man whose life until then had been lived quietly in the shadow of prophecy. Paris was no ordinary prince. Before his birth, it had been foretold that he would bring ruin upon his city, and so he had been abandoned as an infant upon Mount Ida. Yet fate cannot be outrun. A shepherd found the child, and Paris grew up tending flocks, never knowing the destiny that clung to him. It was to this shepherd prince that the goddesses descended, each offering him a bribe in exchange for his judgment. Hera promised him dominion, power beyond imagining, and the rule over vast lands. Athena promised wisdom and victory in battle, the glory of an unconquerable hero. But Aphrodite promised something far more intoxicating than crowns or conquests. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, swayed not by power or wisdom, but by desire, handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, he sealed his fate and the fate of his people, for the woman Aphrodite promised him was Helen, queen of Sparta, already wed to Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae. What Paris could not know was that his choice had already placed Troy on the path to ruin, and that a single act of passion would draw all of Greece into war. The tale of Helen herself was as extraordinary as the war that would be fought in her name. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus, who had taken the form of a swan and seduced or ravished Leda, queen of Sparta. From this union Helen was born, a child of divine and mortal blood, whose beauty was so dazzling that from the moment she reached womanhood, kings and princes across Greece sought her hand. So fierce was the competition that her stepfather, King Tyndareus, feared bloodshed among her suitors. To prevent this, the clever Odysseus of Ithaca proposed an oath, that all who sought Helen's hand must swear to defend her chosen husband against any who would wrong him. Thus, when Helen chose Menelaus as her husband, every prince of Greece was bound by oath to defend their marriage should it ever be violated. Years passed, and Helen became queen of Sparta, ruling beside Menelaus. Yet the gods had not forgotten Paris, nor the promise Aphrodite had made. When Paris journeyed to Sparta, he was received with all the hospitality of the ancient world, for the Greeks prided themselves on welcoming guests as sacred. Menelaus treated him with honor, unaware of the desire kindled in his wife's heart by Aphrodite's influence. Whether Helen went with Paris willingly, enchanted by love, or whether she was taken by force has been debated for millennia. The poets of Greece could never agree, but what mattered was that she left Sparta and sailed to Troy, igniting a fury that would burn for 10 long years. When Menelaus discovered the betrayal, his heart raged with both grief and humiliation. The bond of marriage had been broken, his honor stained, and his guest had stolen from him the very woman whom all Greece had sworn to protect. He turned at once to his brother Agamemnon, who saw in this outrage not only a personal grievance, but an opportunity to unite Greece under his leadership. Messengers were sent across the land, summoning kings and princes to fulfill the oath they had sworn. Odysseus, though reluctant, could not refuse. Achilles, young and destined for greatness, was persuaded to join. Ajax, Diomedes, Nestor, and countless others answered the call. Soon the greatest fleet ever assembled by mortal hands gathered at Aulis, sails ready to carry them east across the Aegean, their mission to bring back Helen and punish Troy. But the gods watched, and the winds refused to blow. At Aulis, the Greeks found themselves trapped, unable to sail, their ships idle in the harbor. Calchas, the seer, revealed the cause. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, was angered by Agamemnon. To appease her, the king must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. In that moment, Agamemnon faced the most harrowing choice of his life. His love for his child weighed against the fate of the expedition and his own ambition. Stories differ on what followed. Some say Iphigenia was slain upon the altar, her blood spilling to calm the winds. Others say Artemis took pity, whisking her away and replacing her with a deer. Whatever the truth, the fleet at last departed, and the black sails of 1,000 ships filled the horizon, bound for Troy. And so the stage was set. What had begun with the tossing of a golden apple had now become a storm that would engulf nations. For love, for honor, for vengeance, and for destiny, the Greeks set sail to bring fire and ruin to the walls of Troy. The gods had played their part, the oaths of men had been bound, and all the world seemed to hold its breath as the greatest war of myth and memory began. The journey across the wine-dark sea was long, yet the Greeks pressed forward with purpose, their sails billowing with the winds they had purchased through sacrifice. At last, the shoreline of Anatolia came into view, the land where Troy stood tall with its proud walls and golden towers, guarding the passage to the east. Before them lay not just a city, but a gateway of trade and power, a prize coveted by many and defended fiercely by its people. When the Greeks disembarked upon the Trojan shores, they wasted no time in making their presence felt. The first to leap from his ship, so the poets say, was Protesilaus, a man destined never to return home, for it had been foretold that the first to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. His bravery was rewarded with immortality in song, though his body fell swiftly beneath Trojan spears. Such was the omen of the years to come, glory intertwined with doom. The Greeks established their camp upon the plain, their ships drawn ashore and protected with ramparts. They raided the surrounding countryside, seizing cattle, burning villages, and cutting off Troy from its allies. In these early years, the war was less a single confrontation and more a long series of raids and skirmishes, a grinding conflict meant to wear down the Trojans. Cities allied with Troy were plundered, their wealth carried back to the Greek ships, their women taken as spoils. Among these captives were two who would later stand at the heart of bitter quarrels: Chryseis, awarded to Agamemnon, and Briseis, given to Achilles. Yet Troy was no weak prize to be plucked without resistance. Its walls, said to have been built by the gods Poseidon and Apollo, loomed impregnable. Its people were brave and skilled, and above all it had a champion whose very name commanded respect. Hector, eldest son of Priam, prince of Troy, husband to Andromache, and father to little Astyanax. Where Paris embodied desire and recklessness, Hector stood as Troy's true defender, a warrior of honor, duty, and tragic destiny. Time and again he led his troops against the Greeks, and time and again the plain of Scamander ran red with blood. The gods, ever restless, watched each clash with hungry eyes. They could not resist taking sides, and soon the battlefield became a stage where divine wills played out through mortal hands. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, still stung by Paris's judgment, while Aphrodite sheltered Troy, loyal to the prince who had chosen her. Poseidon too leaned toward the Greeks, angered by Troy's arrogance, while Apollo and Ares lent their strength to Hector and his kin. The war became a contest not merely of men, but of immortals, their rivalries spilling into human struggle. In those years of stalemate, stories were born that would echo through eternity. One tells of Palamedes, a Greek prince whose cleverness rivaled Odysseus. Yet envy thrives in war, and through treachery and lies, Odysseus contrived his death, ensuring that his brilliance would no longer outshine others. Another tale tells of Achilles' raids, his fury unmatched, his myrmidons leaving smoke and ruin in their wake. Each act of conquest enriched the Greeks, yet each act also deepened the bitterness among them, for pride and rivalry festered within their camp as much as on the battlefield. The Trojans too sought allies far and wide. From distant lands came warriors of renown, the fierce Amazons led by their queen Penthesilea, who fought with the valor of any man. Memnon of Ethiopia, son of the dawn, whose black armor gleamed beneath the Anatolian sun, and Sarpedon, son of Zeus, who led the Lycian hosts with courage that moved even the gods. Each would play their part in the unfolding tragedy, and each would meet their end upon that blood-soaked plain. But even as these tales unfolded, the heart of the war remained unchanged. The Greeks could not breach the walls, and the Trojans could not drive their enemies into the sea. For nearly a decade the conflict lingered, a slow erosion of lives and hopes. Children grew up within the shadow of war. Widows wept for husbands fallen in battles that blurred together, one clash indistinguishable from the next. The gods, who had sparked this war with a single apple, delighted in the suffering they prolonged, for it entertained them to watch mortals toil beneath their games. Yet within the Greek camp, tensions simmered to the breaking point. Agamemnon, proud and imperious, demanded obedience from all, even from Achilles, whose prowess made him the greatest warrior of the age. When the plague struck the Greeks, sent by Apollo in anger at Agamemnon's refusal to release Chryseis back to her father, a Trojan priest, the High King finally relented. But in his rage, he seized Briseis from Achilles, an insult that cut deeper than any wound of battle. It was in that moment that the true tide of the war began to shift. Achilles, outraged and dishonored, withdrew from the fighting, vowing that the Greeks would learn how much they depended on his arm. Without him, their strength faltered, and the Trojans pressed their advantage. For all their numbers and heroes, the Greeks found themselves driven back to their ships, their very survival hanging in the balance. And so the war, stagnant for so long, surged into a new and terrible phase, with Hector at its spearhead and Achilles absent in wrathful silence. The war was no longer merely about Helen, nor about oaths and honor. It had become a crucible of pride, where the fates of nations would hinge upon the anger of a single man. The gods leaned forward from their thrones, mortals braced beneath their armor, and the stage darkened with the promise of tragedy yet to come. Without Achilles, the Greek army was like a body without its heart. Though men like Ajax the Great, Diomedes and Odysseus still fought bravely, they could not match the sheer terror that Achilles inspired on the battlefield. Hector, seeing his moment, rallied the Trojans to push with all their might. Day after day they surged against the Greek fortifications, their spears flashing like a forest in motion, their shields gleaming under the Anatolian sun. And each day the Greeks were driven closer to their ships, until the smoke of Troy's victory fires was almost within sight of the masts. The gods themselves were swept up in the frenzy. Apollo lent strength to Hector's arm, guiding his spear and blinding his foes. Poseidon, angered by the Trojans' arrogance, threw his weight behind the Greeks, lashing the sea into storms that threatened to break their camp. Hera and Athena plotted ceaselessly, whispering courage into the hearts of men, while Aphrodite stood beside Paris, shielding him from certain death, even as he faltered beneath the blows of greater warriors. The battlefield became a chessboard of divine rivalry, with mortal lives sacrificed as pawns in a game that had no compassion. At last the Trojans broke through, storming the Greek defenses and setting fire to the first of their ships. Panic spread among the Greeks, for if their fleet was destroyed, their hope of returning home would vanish. It was then that Patroclus, beloved companion of Achilles, could bear no more the sight of his friends perishing, while Achilles remained aloof in his tent. He pleaded with the son of Peleus, begging him to rejoin the fight, but Achilles, still burning with wounded pride, refused. Instead, he offered his armor to Patroclus, granting him command of the Myrmidons with one warning: drive the Trojans from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Patroclus donned the shining armor of Achilles, and when he appeared upon the field, the Greeks roared with renewed courage. The Trojans, believing Achilles himself had returned, faltered and broke beneath the assault. Patroclus fought with fury, slaying warrior after warrior, his spear flashing like lightning, his chariot carving a path through the chaos. Even Sarpedon, son of Zeus, fell before him, his lifeblood darkening the soil of Troy. The god himself wept for his mortal son, yet even Zeus could not overturn fate. He ordered Hypnos and Thanatos, the twin spirits of sleep and death, to bear Sarpedon's body back to his homeland, while the battle raged on without pause. Emboldened by victory, Patroclus forgot the warning of Achilles. He pressed the Trojans back to their gates, his heart blazing with the fire of conquest. But there, beneath the shadow of Troy's towering walls, Hector awaited him. With Apollo at his side, the Trojan prince struck down Patroclus, piercing him with a spear and leaving him dying upon the earth. With his last breath, Patroclus foretold Hector's doom, declaring that Achilles would return to slay him. Yet even as life fled his body, Hector stripped the armor from him, claiming it as a prize, never knowing that in wearing Achilles' arms, he had dressed himself in the garments of his own death. When word reached Achilles, it was as if the world itself had shattered. His grief was terrible, a howling wound that consumed him. No longer did he care for the insult of Agamemnon, nor for spoils or honor. His wrath now burned with a singular purpose: vengeance for the friend he loved more than any treasure, perhaps more than life itself. He reconciled with Agamemnon, who sought to soothe his rage with gifts, and Thetis, his divine mother, came to comfort him. Knowing her son could not be swayed from battle, she went to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, who crafted for Achilles a new set of armor. Shining with the brilliance of the heavens, its shield etched with the images of earth, sea, and sky. When Achilles emerged again upon the plain, clad in that radiant armor, terror seized the Trojans. His voice thundered across the field like the roar of a god, and even the river Scamander rose in fury to resist the slaughter he unleashed. Hector, who had so often been Troy's unshakable pillar, felt the weight of destiny press upon him. For the first time, doubt gnawed at his courage, for he knew that Achilles was no ordinary foe but doom incarnate, sent to balance the scales of fate. And so the stage was set for the most fateful duel of the war: Hector, defender of Troy, against Achilles, avenger of Patroclus. All of Olympus leaned forward to watch, for in that clash the fate of the war itself seemed to hang. One fought for his city, his family, his honor. The other fought for love, for grief, for vengeance. Both fought beneath the shadow of prophecy, and both knew that only one would walk away from the encounter. The plains before the walls of Troy lay littered with the dead, their bodies a grim testament to the fury of Achilles. The Myrmidons moved like a tide behind him, but it was he alone who bore the force of a storm. His spear seemed guided by the hand of gods, his rage unrelenting, his face like a mask of death. The Trojans, who only days before had driven the Greeks to the brink of ruin, now fled before him as sheep before a lion. Mothers shrieked from the walls, fathers stretched their hands toward their sons, and the city's heart quaked with dread. Among them stood Hector, son of Priam, husband of Andromache, father of Astyanax. He alone did not flee, though terror gnawed at his soul. From the battlements Andromache had begged him to remain within the walls, to guard his life for their child, for their future, but Hector could not. He knew his duty as defender of Troy, and though fear made his limbs heavy, his honor drove him to face the wrath of Achilles. Yet when Achilles drew near, shining like a star in his new-forged armor, Hector's courage faltered. For 3 times he ran around the walls of Troy, pursued by the relentless son of Peleus, while gods themselves debated his fate. Zeus weighed his destiny upon the scales of Olympus, and the balance tipped toward death. At last, Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, tricked him into standing firm. Believing his kin stood beside him, Hector faced Achilles at last. Their duel was swift, for though Hector was valiant, he could not match the fury of Achilles. Spear clashed against shield, dust rose beneath their feet, and the watching Trojans held their breath. Hector's weapon glanced harmlessly from Achilles' armor, while Achilles' spear, guided by Athena, found its mark beneath Hector's collarbone, piercing through and spilling his life upon the earth. As he lay dying, Hector begged Achilles for mercy, that his body be returned to Troy, that his family might give him honor in death. But Achilles, his heart hardened by grief for Patroclus, refused. He swore Hector's corpse would be left for dogs and vultures, though fate would later soften that vow. With Hector's last breath, he foretold again what Patroclus had spoken, that Achilles himself would not live long, that his death too was near. But in that moment, Achilles cared only for vengeance. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, a sight so cruel that even the gods turned away. From the towers, Priam and Hecuba, Hector's parents, watched in horror, their cries echoing through the city. Andromache, rushing to the walls, beheld the scene and fainted, knowing her beloved husband's body would never again embrace her, nor lift their son in his arms. All of Troy sank into mourning, its shield now broken, its greatest warrior silenced. Yet grief is not appeased by cruelty. Achilles, though he defiled Hector's body day after day, felt no peace. He sat by the shore, still consumed by sorrow, speaking to the ghost of Patroclus, longing to see him once more. Thetis, his mother, grieved for her son, for she knew his time was short. For Achilles, by choosing to avenge Patroclus, had embraced the fate he had long known, that his life would be glorious but brief, ending before the fall of Troy. It was Priam, the aged king of Troy, who at last brought a measure of peace. Guided by Hermes, he entered the Greek camp in the dead of night, humbling himself before the man who had slain his son. Kneeling before Achilles, he kissed the hands that had killed Hector, and he spoke of his grief as a father, begging for his son's body. Achilles, moved by the sight, thought of his own father, Peleus, whom he would never see again. His heart softened, and for the first time since Patroclus's death, he wept not with rage, but with sorrow shared. He returned Hector's body to Priam, and for a brief moment, 2 enemies were bound together not by war, but by love and loss. Thus, Hector was borne back to Troy, and the city wailed in mourning. Andromache lamented her husband's death, foreseeing the slavery and suffering that awaited her and their son. Hecuba mourned her child, Priam mourned his heir, and Helen herself, the cause of so much ruin, wept for the man who had never judged her harshly. The funeral pyre blazed, and Hector's ashes were placed within a golden urn, his memory enshrined in the heart of his people. Yet even as Troy mourned, the war was far from over. Achilles' wrath had run its course, but the gods had not finished with him. His glory now shone brighter than ever, but like a flame it consumed itself, for the end was drawing near. And with Hector gone, the last great defender of Troy lay in the earth, leaving the city vulnerable to the tide that would soon overwhelm it. With Hector gone, the Trojans felt the weight of despair settle upon them. Yet war has a way of summoning new heroes when old ones fall, and Troy was not yet ready to surrender its fate. From distant lands came allies drawn by loyalty, pride, or the call of glory. Among them was Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, a woman warrior whose courage was equal to that of any man. Her band of fierce horsewomen thundered onto the plain, their cries piercing the air like arrows, their spears gleaming in the sun. The arrival of Penthesilea brought a flicker of hope to the Trojans. She fought with unmatched skill, her presence on the battlefield like a burning star. With her, the Trojans pressed the Greeks back, striking fear into even seasoned warriors. Yet destiny could not be denied. In the heat of combat, Penthesilea faced Achilles himself. Their clash was fierce, steel ringing against steel, but Achilles, invincible and relentless, struck her down. As she fell, the light of her eyes met his, and in that instant Achilles felt a pang of sorrow, for she was not merely a foe but a figure of beauty and bravery. Some say he even loved her in the moment of her death, though others whispered of shame, for war allows little room for tenderness. Her body was desecrated by jeers from the Greek ranks, but Achilles silenced them, honoring the fallen queen with respect, for even amid his rage he could not ignore her nobility. No sooner had Penthesilea fallen than another great warrior arrived to aid Troy, Memnon, prince of Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Eos. His armor, wrought by Hephaestus himself, shone with divine brilliance, and his stature was said to rival that of Achilles. The two champions met in single combat, their duel shaking the earth with each blow. For long they struggled, neither giving quarter, until Achilles at last struck Memnon down. As his spirit departed, Eos wept across the sky, her tears staining the morning with the colors of grief, for even gods cannot shield their children from the iron hand of fate. But each victory drew Achilles closer to his own end. He had lived his life knowing two destinies lay before him, obscurity in peace or eternal glory in war, purchased at the cost of a short life. By choosing Troy, he had already chosen death, and now fate moved swiftly to claim him. The poets tell that it was Paris, the same prince whose judgment had sparked this war, who loosed the fatal arrow. Guided by Apollo, it flew true and struck Achilles in his one vulnerable place, his heel, left unguarded when Thetis dipped him as a child in the river Styx. The wound was mortal, and though he fought to stand, his strength ebbed from him. The Greeks fought desperately to recover his body, for they would not allow the Trojans to claim it. Ajax the Great bore him upon his shoulders, warding off the enemy, while Odysseus and the others encircled him with shields. At last they carried him back to the camp, where his death was mourned as the greatest blow yet to strike the Greek host. Thetis and her sea nymphs rose from the waves, their cries filling the air, and she held her son's lifeless body, knowing that his glory was eternal, but her heart forever broken. The Greeks raised a funeral pyre, and upon it they placed Achilles, his armor gleaming one last time in the firelight. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus, for in death, as in life, they would not be separated. And so the greatest warrior of Greece passed into legend, his name immortal, his life cut short, his wrath leaving both glory and ruin in its wake. With Achilles gone, the war entered a new and uncertain phase. The Greeks still held many heroes, Ajax, Odysseus, Diomedes, but none could fully replace the son of Peleus. The Trojans too, though wounded by loss, sensed a shift in the balance, for the greatest obstacle to their survival was gone, And though the city still stood besieged, the gods themselves seemed to whisper that the end would come not with Hector, nor with Achilles, but in ways no one yet foresaw. The war, though nearly a decade long, was not finished. New quarrels would arise, new cunning would be devised, and new blood would stain the soil before Troy finally fell. For destiny, patient and inexorable, still had much to weave before the city's towers crumbled into dust. With Achilles gone, the Greeks found themselves adrift. Their greatest shield had fallen, and in the stillness after his funeral pyre burned to ash, a new conflict arose among the survivors. For Achilles' armor, wrought by the hands of Hephaestus himself, could not simply lie unused. Whoever bore it would stand as the preeminent champion of the Achaean host, carrying both the weight of Achilles' glory and the burden of his doom. Two men claimed the right to it. Ajax the Great, towering and steadfast, second only to Achilles in raw might, and Odysseus, cunning and eloquent, whose guile had saved the Greeks time and again. A council was convened, and speeches made before the captains and chiefs. Ajax spoke plainly, reminding them of his valor in battle, his unwavering strength, and his rescue of Achilles' body from the Trojans. Odysseus, with silvered words, spoke of his intelligence, his strategies, and how often wit had achieved what brute force could not. The assembly swayed toward Odysseus, for though Ajax's courage was undeniable, the Greeks had come to value cunning as much as brawn. The armor was awarded to Odysseus, and with that judgment, the seed of tragedy was sown. Ajax, overcome with rage and humiliation, withdrew into the night. His pride, once the foundation of his strength, now became his ruin. In a frenzy of madness sent by the gods, he believed the Greek leaders were mocking him, and in his delusion he set upon the herds of livestock, slaughtering them as if they were his rivals. When the fog of madness lifted and he saw what he had done, shame fell upon him heavier than any armor. Unable to endure the dishonor, Ajax took his own life, falling upon his sword, the earth drinking the blood of one who had stood as a pillar among the Achaeans. The Greeks mourned him, for though he had died in despair, his loyalty and might had long shielded them. But his death also revealed a truth. This war had begun to consume its own heroes, tearing apart not only Troy, but the very men who had sworn to destroy it. Even so, the war pressed on, and the Greeks looked for ways to break the stalemate that still held them outside Troy's walls. A prophecy was recalled, one whispered among seers. Troy would not fall unless Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, came to fight. Odysseus himself was sent to bring the boy from Scyros, where he had been raised. When he arrived, young Neoptolemus proved fierce, reckless, and eager for battle, bearing the same fire in his eyes that had once burned in his father's. With him, the Greeks felt Achilles' spirit had returned, though in untempered youth rather than seasoned rage. But still, prophecies loomed. Another seer declared that Troy could not be taken without the bow of Heracles, a weapon of divine strength. This bow, however, was in the hands of Philoctetes, a warrior abandoned years earlier on the island of Lemnos, after a festering wound made his presence unbearable. The Greeks, ashamed yet desperate, dispatched Odysseus and Neoptolemus to bring him back. Philoctetes, embittered by years of pain and betrayal, at first rejected them, his bow his only companion. Yet after persuasion and the promise of healing, he agreed to return. With his arrival, the Greeks gained not only the bow, but a warrior whose suffering had hardened him into something unyielding. When at last he entered battle, it was Philoctetes who struck Paris with a mortal wound. The prince whose desire had sparked the entire war fell, undone by an arrow of Heracles. Paris, in his final moments, sought the aid of Oenone, but she, remembering how he had cast her aside for Helen, Paris had perished. With Paris gone, the war neared its climax, yet the walls of Troy still loomed unbroken. For 10 years the Greeks had battered themselves against the city, and for 10 years the Trojans had endured. But now the end drew near, not with another duel, nor with another prophecy, but with a trick, a deception so daring that it would become the most infamous ruse in all of history. The death of Paris left Troy shaken, yet the city still stood proud behind its walls. Helen, the woman whose beauty had ignited the flames of war, remained within, and her presence bound the Trojans to their cause. Without Achilles, without Hector, without Ajax, the struggle might have stretched on endlessly, had it not been for a plan so audacious that it would forever define the cunning of Odysseus. The Greeks, wearied of stalemate, gathered in council. It was Odysseus who proposed it. A ruse, a trick born of desperation but woven with genius. He spoke of building a great horse, towering and hollow, fashioned from wood and left as a supposed offering to Athena. It would be constructed so large that it seemed impossible to bring inside the walls by accident, yet irresistible as a token of victory. Inside, he said, their finest warriors would hide, and when night fell they would emerge to open Troy's gates. Many among the Greeks balked at such deceit, for it seemed unworthy of heroes. Yet they had bled for 10 long years, and honor had already been compromised countless times. Slowly, one by one, they agreed. And so, under the eye of Epeus, the carpenter gifted with craft by Athena herself, the horse was built. Its frame rose from the shore like some monstrous idol, its surface polished, its shape both awe-inspiring and ominous. When it was finished, the Greeks staged their ruse. They burned their tents, struck their camp, and sailed away, leaving only the horse behind upon the beach, its massive shadow stretching over the sand. But the fleet had not gone far. They hid behind a nearby island, their sails furled, waiting. At dawn the Trojans emerged upon the plain. The Greek camp was deserted, and before them stood the strange, towering horse. Confusion and wonder filled the air. Some declared it a gift, proof the Greeks had surrendered and sailed home. Others suspected treachery. Among the doubters was Laocoon, the Trojan priest, who warned his people not to trust the horse. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he cried, striking the wooden flank with his spear. The hollow echo rang out, yet fate had already woven its answer. Even as Laocoon spoke, events conspired to silence him. 2 great serpents rose from the sea, coiling and thrashing, and they seized Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their coils before vanishing into the depths. The Trojans, horrified, believed this was punishment for doubting the sacred offering to Athena. The gods, they thought, had shown their will. The horse must be brought into the city. Helen herself approached the horse that evening, circling it, calling out in the voices of the warriors' wives, testing if those hidden within would answer. Inside, Odysseus and his men clenched their teeth and held their silence, resisting the pull of her voice, for they knew discovery now would end all. As night fell, the horse was dragged through the gates with ropes and wheels, the Trojans rejoicing as though victory were theirs. They feasted and drank deep into the night, the streets alive with music and the smoke of sacrifice. For the first time in 10 years, Troy believed itself free. But in the deep of night, as the fires burned low and the city lay heavy in sleep, a hatch opened in the horse. Odysseus, Diomedes, Menelaus, and the chosen warriors slipped out like shadows. They killed the sentries, opened the gates, and raised a signal fire to the waiting fleet. From the sea, the Greek ships returned, silent but swift, and soon the armies poured once more onto the shore. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. The Greeks surged through the sleeping city, torches in hand, swords gleaming in the dark. Houses burned, temples were desecrated, and cries of terror pierced the night. Priam, the old king, sought refuge at the altar of Zeus within his palace, but Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, dragged him through the blood of his sons and struck him down. Cassandra, cursed prophetess, clung to the statue of Athena, but she was torn away and defiled, her warnings forever unheeded, and as flames consumed the towers of Ilium, Aeneas, bearing his father Anchises upon his back and leading his son Ascanius by the hand, fled into the darkness, carrying with him the seed of a future destiny that would one day rise in Rome. Helen, the cause of it all, was sought by Menelaus. Some say he would have struck her down, enraged by the years of war she had cost him. Yet when he beheld her beauty again, his wrath melted, and he spared her, taking her back across the sea. Others whispered that Helen never went willingly to Troy at all, that she had been a phantom while the real Helen lingered elsewhere. But whether guilty or not, she survived when countless others perished. By dawn, Troy was no more. Its walls lay broken, its palaces ash, its people dead or enslaved. The city that had stood for centuries, proud and unyielding, was erased in a single night of fire and treachery. The Greeks had won, but their victory was steeped in blood and shadow. For the gods do not forget such deeds, and the fate of those who destroyed Troy would prove as cursed as the fate of those who had defended it. The dawn after Troy's fall was no triumph. The Greeks walked among ruins, the air heavy with smoke, the earth blackened with blood. The war that had begun with the promise of glory and justice ended in horror, and even as they loaded their ships with spoils and captives, a sense of unease hung over them. For though they had taken the city, they had also desecrated temples, defiled the sacred, and spilled innocent blood in their fury. And the gods, who had watched the war with divided loyalties, were angered. Athena, once the guide and ally of many Greek heroes, turned against them. For Cassandra had been torn from her shrine, for her statues had been toppled, and for her priestesses had been dragged into chains. Poseidon too, god of the sea, looked upon the Greeks with wrath, for their arrogance had offended him. And so, as they sailed home across the wine-dark sea, curses followed in their wake. The returns of the heroes, the Nostoi, became tales as dark and sorrowful as the war itself. Agamemnon, commander of all the Greeks, reached his palace at Mycenae with Cassandra at his side. Yet no welcome awaited him. Clytemnestra, his queen, had not forgotten the daughter he sacrificed at Aulis to launch the war, sweet Iphigenia, offered to appease Artemis's anger. When Agamemnon stepped into his hall, she greeted him with false warmth, but soon as he bathed, she and her lover Aegisthus struck him down. Cassandra too met her death, crying out her visions to deaf ears one final time. The house of Atreus, cursed long before, was stained deeper in blood. Menelaus, who had endured 10 years for Helen, brought her back across the sea. Some say storms drove them far and wide before they reached Sparta. Yet when he looked upon her, the old anger melted, and Helen's beauty conquered him once more. Whether guilty or innocent, she reclaimed her place as queen beside him, her legend forever entwined with his. Odysseus, the mastermind of Troy's fall, suffered the longest and strangest of all journeys. For 10 years he wandered, blown from land to land, tormented by Poseidon, who remembered how Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops. He faced enchantresses, monsters, storms, and temptations, while back in Ithaca, his wife Penelope held their home against 100 greedy suitors. Only after 2 decades did he return, ragged and disguised, to reclaim his house with bow and vengeance. His tale would become another epic unto itself, the Odyssey, showing that victory at Troy was only the beginning of another struggle. Other fates were no kinder. Ajax the Lesser, who had dragged Cassandra from Athena's altar, was struck by a storm at sea. His ship was shattered, and though he clung to a rock, boasting that not even the gods could destroy him, Poseidon split the stone beneath him and cast him into the depths. Diomedes, though spared the wrath of the sea, found his wife unfaithful upon his return and was driven from his city wandering as an exile. Nestor alone, the old wise king, reached home in peace, as if his long life and good counsel had earned him rare mercy. The sons of Troy, too, scattered into legend. Aeneas, who carried his father and household gods through the fire, journeyed westward, guided by fate. His path led him to Italy, where his descendants would one day raise the walls of Rome. In him, Troy survived, not in stone but in spirit, carried across seas to be reborn in another world. Thus the war's aftermath spread its shadow across nations. For the Greeks it brought no peace, only strife, exile and sorrow. For the Trojans it brought ruin, yet also a seed of new destiny. And above all, it proved that no mortal victory could escape the will of the gods, who weave men's lives as they please, and who punish arrogance as swiftly as they reward valor. And so, the Trojan War did not end with the burning of a city. It echoed in the halls of Greece, in the voyages of wandering kings, in the founding of empires yet unborn. It was a war that destroyed one world while planting the seeds of another. Even as Troy lay in ashes and the Greeks returned to fractured homes, the war did not vanish from memory. Its heroes, its tragedies and its intrigues were spoken of in hushed tones around fires, recounted by wandering bards, and carved into the minds of those who would tell tales for generations. For the Trojan War was not merely a conflict of men, it was a canvas upon which the gods painted their rivalries, and upon which humanity glimpsed both courage and folly in its purest form. Poets and storytellers in Greece labored to preserve the deeds of Achilles, Hector, Odysseus and others, weaving their stories into epic verse. Homer, centuries later, would take the strands of memory and song, shaping them into the Iliad and the Odyssey, immortalizing both the grandeur and horror of war. Within these tales, Hector became the model of nobility, a man bound by duty to his city and family, yet doomed by fate. Achilles embodied the brilliance and wrath of mortals, his strength unmatched, his choices both noble and tragic. Helen's beauty, whose face had launched 1,000 ships, became a symbol of desire and destruction, a reminder that love, when intertwined with pride and ambition, could ignite conflicts beyond comprehension. Scholars and philosophers debated whether she acted from passion, from divine manipulation, or from human frailty, and her ambiguity ensured that she would remain forever both muse and scapegoat in myth. The Greeks themselves were remembered as a mixture of heroism and folly. Odysseus's cunning would become synonymous with intelligence and strategy, a reminder that brute strength alone does not win wars. Ajax's tragedy became a moral lesson, a cautionary tale about pride, honor, and the human cost of rage. Even the gods' capriciousness entered human memory, a warning that mortals were always subject to forces beyond their control. Beyond literature, the Trojan War left echoes in ritual and culture. Cities claimed descent from its heroes, from the bloodlines of Aeneas to the houses of Greek kings. Temples honored those who had fought and died, sacrifices commemorated the fallen, and festivals celebrated both the bravery and cunning displayed during the decade-long siege. Troy itself, though destroyed, became a symbol of resistance, of tragic beauty, and of the terrible consequences of desire left unchecked. The war also became a moral mirror, reflecting both the nobility and the darkness of humankind. It demonstrated the consequences of pride, the pain of revenge, and the fragility of honor. Mortals learned that glory is fleeting, that even heroes cannot escape fate, and that acts of love and desire may yield destruction beyond imagining. And for centuries, leaders and poets alike would point to the war as both inspiration and warning, drawing from it lessons of courage, cunning, and caution. Even as Troy faded into memory, its myth endured, carried across seas and generations. The Romans claimed Aeneas as their forefather, linking their empire to the sacred ruins of a city destroyed yet immortal in legend. Greek tragedies and comedies invoked the war's heroes, reminding audiences that human emotion, love, jealousy, pride, grief, shapes history as much as spears and ships. And in every retelling, from bardic song to epic poem, the war's story expanded, enriched by the imagination of those who would never see its fields of death, but felt its echoes in every heroic struggle. Thus, the Trojan War survived beyond the fall of its walls and the deaths of its champions. It became timeless, a mirror reflecting the interplay of gods and men, the collision of desire and destiny, and the power of memory to keep even the most tragic events alive. For while Troy burned and Achilles fell, the story endured, whispering to all who would listen that love and war are forces eternal, and that from a single choice, an apple tossed by a spiteful goddess, an entire world can be reshaped forever. The smoke of Troy had long since cleared, yet the story of its rise and fall remained etched in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed it, even if only in memory. From the moment a golden apple sparked a quarrel among the goddesses to the burning of its towers, the Trojan War had been shaped by desire, pride, and divine intervention, a tapestry woven with both mortal valor and celestial caprice. The fall of Troy demonstrated the fragile boundary between love and ruin. Paris's choice, guided by Aphrodite, had kindled a chain of events that no mortal foresight could undo. Helen, the spark of desire, had become both symbol and scapegoat, embodying the dangerous potency of beauty and the ways in which human passion can ripple outward, reshaping kingdoms and destinies. Yet the war had shown that love alone could never explain tragedy. Honor, revenge, pride, and vengeance each played their part, intertwined with human emotion so tightly that they became indistinguishable from fate itself. Heroes had risen and fallen, their deeds celebrated and lamented. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, had faced the wrath of Achilles with courage, leaving behind a city that mourned its greatest champion. Achilles, whose fury had shifted the tide of battle, had burned brightly and briefly, a figure of wrath and glory, consumed by the very honor he sought to preserve. Patroclus had fallen to remind the living that bonds of friendship and loyalty carry weight equal to that of kings and warriors. And Ajax, Odysseus, Neoptolemus and the others had walked the line between valor and folly, their triumphs inseparable from tragedy. Even the gods, whose whims had steered mortals like ships on the stormy sea of fate, were shown to be both architects and spectators of suffering. Zeus, Athena, Apollo and Aphrodite wove their rivalries into human history, guiding, tempting and punishing alike. Yet they too were bound by cosmic balance. No god could entirely undo the consequences of their interference, and no mortal could fully escape the designs of fate. The city itself, reduced to ashes, became eternal in its absence. Troy lived on in the stories of the survivors, in the voyages of Aeneas to distant lands, and in the retelling by poets who transformed history into legend. Its memory was a reminder that even the mightiest walls cannot protect against the combination of human ambition, divine manipulation, and the inexorable pull of destiny. From its ruins sprang new myths, new lineages, and new empires, proving that endings are never total, and that from destruction comes the possibility of rebirth. The Trojan War, in the final reckoning, was more than a battle over a woman or a city. It was a mirror of humanity, reflecting the complexities of desire, the consequences of pride, the bonds of friendship, and the inexorable march of fate. It was a tale of love and rage, of honor and loss, of courage tested against the unyielding hand of destiny. And in its telling, for every generation that listened or read, it carried lessons both timeless and immediate, that the choices of mortals can shake the heavens, that the smallest act, like a single apple tossed among goddesses, can unleash calamities beyond imagining, and that even in tragedy, the human spirit persists, shaping memory, myth, and history itself. And so the story of the Trojan War endures not only in its battle's heroes and victims, but in the eternal question it poses. How much is determined by the will of the gods, and how much by the choices of men? In that question lies its power, its sorrow, and its immortal fascination. For the war that began with love and desire ended with ruin, yet its memory continues to teach, to warn, and to inspire. Troy may have fallen, its towers toppled and its streets silent, but its story, like the courage of its defenders and the wrath of its conquerors, will never die.